I'm Chance Dorland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com.
One of my kids. When we asked the kids what did they think, if they were excited that Dad is not going to be traveling as much, that we were going to be able to go to Argentina, I say, yeah. But I don't want you to retire. That Nico, my oldest. Really? Okay. Maybe he has a point. Why? Well, the chicken tenders in the family room are awesome. No, I'll get you some chicken tenders at a different situation. That can't be the reason why I stay. So I said no. So I was convinced there. That was the thing that he wanted me to stay.
And that was San Antonio Spurs legend Manu Ginobili recently speaking with reporters at the Spurs practice facility. San Antonio Express News Spurs beat writer Jeff McDonald has been writing about these recent Manu updates, and as you just heard, very important information there. And all that, of course, is available now at expressnews.com. And now let's hear from Jeff himself to go over a little bit more of that Manu Ginobili news, and then also have a discussion here towards the end of the podcast episode about the upcoming Spurs training camp. So, Jeff, great to have you back here on the podcast. It just felt like people were finally getting over the shock of losing Manu Ginobili after all those seasons. So why this press conference over the weekend?
Oh, I think we all needed closure. I mean, this has been a guy that's been in our lives, so to speak, for 16 years, and it would have been weird for him to just disappear from our lives without saying goodbye. And I think that's what that presser was about. And as Manu said during the presser, like he didn't want to do it immediately upon his retirement because the emotions were just too raw for him. He wanted to give it a couple of weeks to let it, let everything settle, let the emotions even out, and then he could come tell us goodbye and talk to us about his decision and what he plans to do later. And it wasn't something that really I think he wanted to do, but I think it's something the Spurs impressed on him that was necessary for him to do because he is possibly the most popular player in Spurs history. And, the fans are going to miss him, and this gives them a little bit of closure to be able to talk to him vicariously one more time.
And so, of course, let's reopen the wound. Let's talk about that decision. Was that something that Manu made based on how he was feeling, at the time after the season where they kept their, postseason streak alive? Obviously, it didn't turn out in a way that they had wanted to, but still, a solid season, keeping with Spurs history. Or is this decision that he made to leave the team after 16 seasons in San Antonio, was that something he'd been considering for longer than that?
Yeah, he's 41 now, and I would imagine he's been thinking about the future and when to retire for 4 or 5 years now, just because as you get into your late 30s as an NBA player, that's just so you're thinking about your own career mortality at that point. And I know he said, really going into the season before last, 2016-17, he really wasn't sure if that was going to be his last one or if he had more in the tank. And he took the summer to kind of think about it and talk with his family. And then when he came back in August to the Spurs practice facility, they usually have just sort of open gyms and time for players just informally to play and work out. And when he came back in August of 2017 with his mind not quite made up, he saw the guys working out and those juices started flowing again. And he realized that he really did want to do this again. And then he said this summer, he had gone into this final season thinking it would be his final season and kind of approaching it that way, in every arena, kind of taking in the sights and sounds and kind of relishing it and savoring what he kind of thought in his head was going to be his last season. But he wanted to leave the door open in case he changed his mind. And when he came back from vacation this year, he kind of said that he felt the opposite as he did the year before. He saw the guys working out, the young kids, the 20-year-olds, and just realized he didn't have it in him anymore to do all that he needs to do to get his body right and in shape to go through another 82-game NBA season. And as you can imagine, the older you get, the more it takes. to get your body in that shape. And he just kind of realized that his initial knee-jerk sort of thought that this would be his last season was probably correct. And so he made the final decision in August.
So that's not late breaking news. We've been talking about that for some time, as you mentioned.
Yes.
But they had that presser this weekend. You said closure. Also, maybe some information about what the future holds for Manu Ginobili. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of fanfare when they retire that jersey. But what can you say about his plans post-retirement? Did he talk about that at all?
A little bit. And one thing he said he's enjoying is that he doesn't have a lot of long-term plans right now. Like for the first time, in 23 years, he's been a professional basketball player, both with the Spurs and then before that overseas. For the first time in 23 years, he doesn't really have to have long-term plans. For so long, it was gearing up for the next thing, the next season, the next Olympics, the next international competition, the next Spurs season. He doesn't have to do any of that now. In the short term, he said he's going to hang around San Antonio for a while. His kids have started school here. This year, but he said in December he wants to take his family back to Argentina for a lengthy visit. And part of it is December is summertime in Argentina. We don't always think in those terms, but he's never spent a summer in his home country, in the last 20 some odd years. So he said it was important to him to take his kids back to his homeland and have a summer there when the weather is nice and everyone's happy and the beaches are teeming and all that stuff. So really that's his only plan short term, or to hang around San Antonio in December. Said he'll still be around the practice facility, around the team. If any of the younger players want to talk to him for advice, he'll be around for that. And then he's going to go to Argentina for a while in December. And then after that, we'll see. I mean, we don't know what the future holds for him. He's a guy that's always held a lot of interests outside of basketball, has always been a guy that enjoyed traveling and seeing the world. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of that in his future.
Yeah, check out social media for the Chicken Finger World Tour with Manu and his children. I'm sure that's coming up as well.
Yeah, they could taste test them in places all over the world. It'd be great.
That would be a YouTube sensation. Wait for it. It's coming. So lots of Manu Ginobili talk, obviously well-deserved. Let's move on, and maybe we won't be speaking about Manu here on the pod for quite some time. Of course, the team he used to play for several years with the San Antonio Spurs. This is their last week before their training camp kicks off. Tell me about that.
Training camp starts, I think they have their media day on Monday, and then their first practice would be on Tuesday coming up next week. So the off-season, we're in the final little bit of the home stretch of the off season, and it's just going to be one of the more interesting training camps in recent memory for the Spurs, just because there's been so much turnover and so many new faces, and you're losing Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker and Danny Green, who would have been your three longest tenured players off last year's roster, and losing some other players as well. If you just go back to 2015-16, which is only 2 years ago, there's only two guys left on the roster from that team, Patty Mills and LaMarcus Aldridge. Everything else is turned over. So it's going to be a very interesting training camp as far as just learning the new guys' names and then what they can do, how they fit, how they mesh together. It's going to be, I think, a little bit of fun for Greg Popovich to figure out, the best way to utilize all these guys, because for so long he had that core of Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Kawhi Leonard to work around, and that sort of set some things in stone. Now it seems like it's almost a blank slate for them in this really new era.
So you just laid down some interesting perspectives for this upcoming training camp. You might just call it like camp. I mean, this is, really rebuilding, starting things off from scratch in a lot of ways. What are you paying attention to right now?
I think the first guy everyone's going to want to see is DeMar DeRozan, which is the guy that the Spurs got in the trade with Toronto for Kawhi Leonard. And he's an all-star. He's one of the best scoring guards in the league. I think a lot of Spurs fans will be interested to see how he fits and what he looks like paired with LaMarcus Aldridge, who was their leading scorer last year when Leonard was out with the injury. So that's going to be the first big name I think people are going to look at as far as new players coming in. And then I think, I think people will still be interested in how some of the holdovers develop. They've got this young point guard, DeJounte Murray, who I believe turned 22 today, actually. So he's young and took over the starting job last year for Tony Parker and had some good moments and some not so good moments, but definitely you can see the upside with him. So I think Spurs fans will be interested to see, what he's done over the summer, in the laboratory, so to speak, what he's added. Can he take the jump to the next level and be, a borderline star, which I think is his ceiling. So those are a couple things we'll look at. But with such a new roster, I mean, there's going to be a lot of storylines coming out of this training camp. And for me personally, I think it'll be fun to cover because we won't be covering a lot of the same old ground that we've been covering, for a decade plus. There's going to be a lot of newness to it. And I think that can be exciting for at least for the people covering it. That's kind of an exciting thing because you get some new narratives and storylines.
And I guess it would be good to point out, maybe for the uninitiated or anyone who needs a little bit of a refresher, what exactly is meant when a team says they're having training camp?
Well, basically, it's going to be the first practices of the season that are, as you sort of, it's really, to be honest, it's really your only really good chance throughout the whole season to get in a good spate of practices all in a row. Because once the season starts, you're playing games every other night, especially with the Spurs. Coach Greg Popovich likes to give the team, rest and rest them instead of practice them so they can go weeks and sometimes as long as a month during the season without a practice. Training camp is the only time where you really have a chance to really have intense practices where you're installing the playbook, going over the offense, going over the defense, adding in little wrinkles to the offense and defense, conditioning work that you're not going to do during the year, really. And it'll be really important this year because, as we mentioned, so many new faces that are sort of uninitiated in the Spurs system and not with what Pop likes to call corporate knowledge. Not a lot of that still around because you've lost that with Parker and Ginobili and Leonard and Green and all those guys gone. People that know the ropes and know the offense, know the defense, know all the little ins and outs of it. A lot of those guys are gone. So this is going to be a really big, I think, teaching training camp as far as initiating the new players into the system and even some of the younger players that maybe had not played a lot in the past. Now they're going to have to know a lot more. And I think you're going to see all of that come to bear during this training camp. But it's really the only chance between now and next training camp when you're going to have a chance to do 4, 5, 6, 7 practices all in a row because that just doesn't happen. Fans would be really surprised how little NBA teams practice once the season begins. It's almost all on the fly at that point. That the practices all usually, the majority of them, especially the intense ones, come in the days and weeks before the actual games start to count.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that why the Chicago Bulls back in the day were so good? Because they just kind of threw the ball around?
Yeah, pretty much. They had Michael Jordan and the best player in the world, so it was easy. It was easy for them.
Excellent. Yeah. Going back to corporate knowledge, I'd love to see some photo on Twitter or Instagram go out there that, one of the players runs off to the locker room, drops his corporate knowledge pamphlet that's being handed out during training camp. That would be, if anyone wants to Photoshop that would put a smile on my face. Wrapping things up, Jeff, said we're not going to talk about Manu anymore, but to go back just for a second, if you will, we've kind of gone through the 7 stages of Manu Ginobili grief. And now we're to acceptance. Everything's good for him. Spending time with his family. Everyone's happy for all the great time that he gave the San Antonio Spurs. Is that the last big story that we're going to hear from the team for some time? I mean, I think a lot of people would think that would be great. Do you think that's probably the last big headline that we'll hear out of San Antonio for a while?
Well, first of all, I have not reached the acceptance stage yet on the Manu Ginobili retirement. I think the first time I walk into that locker room and he's not there to just shoot the breeze with I'm gonna feel that hole in my life, so to speak, once again. But I mean, you never know in this business what the last big story is going to be. I mean, if you think back to last season at this point last year, nobody thought we'd spend the whole season talking about Kawhi Leonard's injury. It was not on anybody's radar that within 12 months, Kawhi Leonard to be traded to Toronto. That just all sort of happened organically over the course of the season. And there are other things that popped up over the course of last season. I mean, like, tragically during the playoffs, Greg Popovich's wife dies. Like, that's a big story that nobody foresaw. There'll be something. I just talking from experience, having covered this team for 11 seasons and counting now, there'll be something that pops up along the way that qualifies as a quote-unquote big story. And it might be a positive thing. It might be a not-so-positive thing. I think Spurs fans at this point, over the past 12 months, have taken enough hits that they probably deserve the next big story to be something, positive and uplifting instead of something that rips their guts out. But you never know. It's an unpredictable business, an unpredictable sport, and it's unpredictable covering it.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News Spurs beat writer Jeff McDonald for joining me today, and also several of the last episodes of the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.